Welcome to African Drums. I'm your host, LP Harry, and I'm glad that you've joined me this evening. Last Sunday, we had our first installment of a two-part conversation on race, which focused primarily on historical perspectives. We are aware that Guyana has primarily 6 different race groups, along with the increasing prevalence of Guyanese of mixed race or ethnicity interact with each other in our single geographical space is particularly important because this impacts. Continue the discussion with a focus on contemporary perspectives. Panelists will discuss, among other things, the state of ethnic relations in Guyana, the legitimate concerns of the various ethnic groups. Okay, we're having some difficulties here, so we're going to take a break. We'll start again in just a minute. Thank you. Good evening. Welcome back to African Drums. I apologize for a bit of technical difficulties that we had just now. You know how these things work. Sometimes they're uncontrollable. I was saying that last evening we had our first installment of a two-part conversation on race, which focused primarily on historical perspectives. We are aware that Guyana has primarily 6 different races or ethnic groups, along with the increasing prevalence of Guyanese of mixed race or ethnicity. How we interact with each other in our single geographical space is particularly important because this impacts our national development. Tonight, we continue the discussion with a focus on contemporary perspectives. Panelists will discuss, among other things, the state of ethnic relations in Guyana, the legitimate concerns of various ethnic groups, and will give their thoughts on actions that are necessary to move Guyana in a forward direction. My guests this evening should be no strangers to you at home, since they're quite active in civic life in Guyana. Ms. Nadia Sagar is an attorney at law and social activist. Mr. Ruel Johnson is a writer, and Ms. Jean LaRose is the executive director of the Amerindian People's Association, and she is Lokono from Santa Rosa Village in Region 1. Sisters, brother, welcome to African Drums.
Thank you.
Okay. And I'm happy to have each of you here with me tonight. The first question that I want to ask each of you is, how do you view the state of the ethnic relations currently in Guyana?
Big question, Elsie. I don't know. How do I view it? I think there's a tension. I think there's always been a tension. I think that tension has been exacerbated with recent oil discoveries, insecurities about the future, what many see as an economic decline. So there's a lot going on in Guyana, and people are uncertain about the future, and I think that uncertainty is fueling tensions around ethnic security.
Okay, thank you, Nadia.
I would say there are times when things seem to be okay, that we work together, we come together as one people, irrespective of what our ethnicities are, and there are other times when it just don't work. I think one of the things that is creating attention is the violence and the state of the not being the brutality and the openness to violence from thefts and robbery and the kind of thing is causing some problems for people as well. Yeah.
Ruel?
I guess the metaphor I like to use is when there's a huge fire, and then the fire itself dies down. If you see the fire being the sort of conflagration we had in the 60s in the lead up to independence, and of course there was the time, I think in the late 90s, where they were very overt ethnic tensions, etc. And after that major conflagration goes, there's a sort of a layer of ash that you believe signals some sort of normalcy. But underneath that ash is always this glowing thing that once you poke it, it can spark up again. And I think that is essentially how we've been historically, particularly since the 60s. When you have these conflagrations, and then you have this layer of this thing that looks cool and feels cool to the touch and the surface, but if you dig a bit deeper, the heat is very much there.
Elsie, I want to quote from 2014 Republic of Guyana Distinguished Lecture by Clem C. Turan, and I think I came across this, and I was going through it, and although he was speaking in 2014, he could have been speaking now. He says, because of Guyanese inability to address deep racial insecurities, the source of the political intractability over many decades, it's arguable that the country is sitting on a volcano, however dormant it may appear at the present time. The El Dorado complex, which is so crucial to the colonizing of an inhospitable Guyana, is as vibrant as ever, now that it seems that the country will be producing oil. This breeds envy and invidious comparisons between ethnic groups as to who will be the beneficiary of this impending wealth. The largely unknown hinterland has played a similar role historically, deepening mutual ethnic suspicions. Consequently, enhanced national wealth could well be a source not of optimism for the future, but a big bone of contention, with serious implications for the political trajectory of the country.
Yeah.
I think that kind of sums up where we are at the moment, for me. Anyway, I'm not sure what the others think, but
Well,
I
that
think
is kind of in line with what Ruel says, actually.
But it adds. I think it adds reinforced by what both of the panelists have said. You have the reality of the violence, however it's expressed, however it's perceived as being carried out, and then there's just one primary concern that I have is that the oil wealth. We say impending wealth as if we say the same tone we say impending doom. Right? There is this rabid competition currently for ownership or hegemony within a particular space for particular resources and particular legitimacy. Now you have that multiplied by wealth, and you don't see the competition receding, but being exacerbated by that wealth. And that is a dangerous place to be at currently.
Yeah, very often the indigenous population, because we are so far from all that happens on the coast and all that happens in the capital as well, sometimes is often forgotten. And in being forgotten, what happens sometimes is we're talking oil wealth here, but some of the very wealth that is being extracted from the interior, gold, diamond.
That's historically such.
It's a similar relationship where those extractive activities breed tension for indigenous people when it comes to land rights, when it comes to security of the environment, and understanding who we are in terms of dependence on the land, dependence on the waters is important for us in terms of when we talk about our security. It's not really trying to rob the other Guyanese of what the country wealth has, but it's respecting who we are as a people and who we depend on. Now, before I came here, I was having a conversation with two youths of indigenous ancestry, One works in Georgetown here. They're very qualified, right? And he knows his thing. But I asked him, I said, what do you think? Have you experienced? Give me your personal experience of racism as a young person. He said, I experience it almost every day. That was his answer. And he went on to explain, and it's sad that for us, it's because you're seen as, you should not be able to write in this manner. You should not be able to fix this computer in this manner. You should not be able to think in this manner because you come from the bush, you know, and that's sometimes it's frustrating, sometimes it creates a withdrawal, sometimes it creates confrontation, you name it.
Okay, I'm glad that you mentioned this because the next thing that I wanted to get from you is what has history and your personal experiences taught you about ethnic relations in Guyana?
Wow. My personal history, I came from a community where I left at a primary school age to come to Georgetown into a totally foreign environment when it came to cars running on the road, when it came to using a telephone, when it came to doing anything that we do not have back in the interior. And that is decades ago. I still see the same thing impacting our people when people from the elder generation come to the city and they do not understand how to use certain amenities. They may go to a health center. They do not understand how to have a conversation with that nurse, with that doctor. They may go apply for a passport. They don't understand to have a conversation with that person. And unfortunately, those officials don't understand how to have a conversation with us as well, understanding that we don't come from that same background where we have the same amenities, where we can readily call on certain things to happen. And it needs an understanding of where we come from, who we are. It's not that our people want to change that, but they just want an understanding. Right?
Thank you.
I always think there are three Guyanas. You know, there's the hinterland, there's rural Guyana, and then there's urban Guyana. And they're all very different, made up of very different people. And I think we haven't really, even in 2018, bridged the sort of cultural divide that exists. And it's racial, it's cultural, it's both. But, you know, I think when we talk about race and ethnicity, we should be, I just want to come to that because when we're talking about race, you're talking about physical characteristics, skin color and so on. When you're talking about ethnicity, you're talking about culture. You know, shared language, food, whatever. And I think that we very often talk about a Guyanese culture. We're Guyanese, we have a Guyanese culture. But that, I think, means different things to different people. And I'm not sure that that in itself has ever really been understood. Because there's still tremendous divisions, even when you move from one part of Guyana to another, and you see it, you feel it. And you know, I'm not sure how we get there. I mean, we'll talk about that a bit later. But I think that we need to start thinking about the language you use and how we perceive others. You know, very often there's some truth contained in stereotypes. That's why stereotypes exist. Yeah? But a lot of how we frame things are usually through the lens of stereotypes. And that, unfortunately, has been our experience in Guyana. And it happens maybe because, you know, the lack of education and so on, and being able to see people as individuals rather than belonging to a particular group and therefore applying a particular, you know, idea about them to them. So, and then the narrative, the language we use, how we refer to people, the casual, everyday racism that we engage in without thinking about it, without thinking about how it then transcends and becomes something bigger, but also how it passes down to the young people and how they see it. And I was talking to, I did a lecture at the school about, well, we were talking about constitutional reform, and then the subject came up of race and voting along party lines and so on. And a young lady, Afro-Guyanese, who said, you know, that her experience in school has been so different from what her experience is in her community. She goes home, and her, there's all this talk about, Indians vote PPP, Afros vote, PNC, and so on. And it's very rigid views about how things are in Guyana. And then she goes to school, which is, they're all mixed up, they're all integrating, they're all liming, they're all hanging out, they're all, those barriers don't exist in school. And she was sort of expressing her frustration with being in those two worlds, and sometimes feeling like, she wants to challenge what is being said at home, but she doesn't want to rock the boat, because very often what our parents and grandparents think becomes, it passes down to the children, and that forms the narrative within your community or your home and so on. And that can be quite, that can have a profound effect on you, I think, as individuals.
Yeah.
That's the thing. I think what's sort of come out in both presentations there is the issue of language. And language exists for one core purpose, which is to communicate. And what we've been absent is, I think at the national level and the state level, is a conversation on this very issue, because this has been the critical issue running through the thread of our history. We haven't had this conversation. What's important, and this is why shows like forums like this are critical, is that this is the conversation that needs to happen, happening and being put out in the media, and it's part of what needs to take place at a sustained and national level. In the COP of 2014, I remember Nadia sort of curated a similar conversation. I hosted at Amerindian, and we had these experiences from indigenous people, from Afro-Guyanese, from Indo-Guyanese, about their own personal experiences. We have a lot of heart being expressed, but also in some cases you got culpability being expressed. Somebody saying that, okay, I am one person, a good friend of mine, who was a lecturer at UG, and who was Afro-Guyanese and felt slighted and attacked by Indo-Guyanese students who made a hint about her going back to Africa and stuff like that. And then remember her, she also put forward a story in which it was sort of Christmas lottery to get a child to come and spend Christmas with you and stuff like that. And the child was assigned to her from an orphanage was an Indo-Guyanese child, and she felt awkward, and she felt that she couldn't have connected to that child. So simply because they're Indo-Guyanese, sort of reflexive implicit racism on her part, and she owned it as much as she complained that she felt as a victim in another circumstance. I think this is the sort of conversation we need to have, and we need to have it boldly, and it's happening around the world. I mean, in Trinidad right now, conversation is taking place with regard to, say, white privilege in Caribbean literature. And it's happening on social media, and it involves some friends of mine who are involved in the sort of literary world. And for me, I mean, speaking as signing off here as a writer, I think artists have a particular role to play in expressing and leading this conversation in art. And this is where, again, you've gone into media and stuff like that, but you write poetry.
Yeah.
I know Nadia wrote some very moving blog pieces on the issue a couple of years ago, and she stopped.
He's calling you out.
I know, I don't know why. I've been writing just quietly.
The indigenous languages and language as an indigenous culture as a component of national identity is a critical thing, and that is where we have the problem in terms of communication. As simple things as, say, health services, access to health services, and one of the things I've looked at in my work with government is access to education. That has to be taken into both the conversation as well as the solutions that come out of it. So,
I want to look, tagging from what you just said there, look inwardly at, and I'm looking at the people I'm most connected with and most familiar with as well, in terms of pride in who you are. Right? Education. I feel, and that's not only my feeling, that the education system for the indigenous people tend to work against pride,
yeah.
pride of a people. About 4 months ago, I was having a conversation in my village with a grouping of village leaders, and we were talking about, like, what is your role? What could be your role as different from what the piece of is written on a piece of paper that somebody say you have to do? And one of the things they came up with was that, you know what, even in our village as a grouping there, we don't teach our histories. We don't teach our history as indigenous people, and our children from this grouping of communities don't understand our history as a people from the Moroka sub-district, because we don't teach it in our school. How can we have pride if we don't know our history? How can we have a conversation with somebody else who is denigrating us and belittling us if we don't know our history? And I think our education system has to be flexible enough to bring all of this, not only for indigenous people, but for everybody. Because I have a daughter who is mixed, black and Amerindian. She knows more of her Amerindian culture because she lives with her mother. But from the other side, what is that part of the culture that she's learned from the other side of her family? And I'm not sure what the situation is for others like her, But because I live my culture, we're talking culture here, and it forms part of the education that she got, she understands this from my side. And she travels in the interior, therefore she gets the feel of that environment as well, right? Same thing, our children who come to the city, it's good for them to come and experience another aspect of culture as well. But how many children go to the interior to understand how we live? Not many.
Yeah, I have
Not
to make
many.
a confession that I've never been to the interior.
Really?
You must come. You must come.
You know, and that's actually really sad, because there are actually people who live their whole lives in Georgetown or, in urban areas and never go to the interior. So they have an idea based on things they see in pictures, but,
Yes,
but
that's in
they've
pictures.
never, experienced the reality. So they don't connect to that part of Guyana. That part of Guyana doesn't belong
And
to
that's
them.
a sad part, because you borrow from North America and you borrow from other places and you use that to subjugate a people when you don't know their culture, right?
Okay. Let's talk about, you mentioned that your daughter is mixed. Let's talk about the composition of the ethnic makeup in Guyana. How is it different now from what it was in the past?
Oh my goodness. Well, some people might say, first of all, that I'm not sure if I'm, opening a can of worms here on TV, but some people argue, I know some people on social media have been in heated debates about this, whether, to say Portuguese is correct, because, Portuguese is actually European, so therefore we don't have, we always claim Portuguese as a race, but it's not actually. So, I don't know. Maybe that's something, people want to debate elsewhere, but it's changing. It's changing all the time, and now you've got Brazilians coming into Guyana. You've got maybe a few Venezuelans. I don't know how many. You've got other people. You have. I'm sure I see a lot more Chinese from mainland China coming in. I'm sure it's changing in ways that we don't even fully understand as yet. I have to tell you, I have a friend a Guyanese who went to live in Colombia, and I always tell this story because I was so proud when he brought his Colombian wife, who is white, Spanish, Caucasian Spanish, Colombian, and he brought her to Guyana, and she was so shocked by the various mixtures, and she came and we met her, and she said, in Colombia, although you have all these different races, they tend not to mix as much. So you have these groups of people who are very clearly demarcated in terms of race. In Guyana, She said you'll see, what did she say? And these are her exact words, not mine. She said you'll see a Chinese man holding a black baby, and meaning that's his child. But that to her, in her way of communicating that, was that this was so unreal and unbelievable to her that she said this was something she'd never witnessed. And I felt really good about that, because I think we take for granted, first of all, that that this mixing is, it's just, it is what it is.
Yeah.
And we take it for granted and we don't think about it. But if you travel, if you go elsewhere, you will see that we're unique in that regard.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think, just and I think that's something we don't appreciate enough. That said, I also think that the way we're not unique is that we have ethnic, racial problems just like many other countries, but we have a tendency for inward-looking behavior, so that when something happens, it's always, throw our hands up, God, it's so terrible because all this is happening, and these, everybody hates everybody, and that kind of knee-jerk response. If you look around the world at what's happening, there are so many countries that are experiencing that kind of tension, that kind of conflict. Look at London, the UK rather. Look at the US. Brexit wouldn't have happened if there wasn't that kind of tension, that building up of cultures clashing and people, pulling back, or if you want to say pushing back or whatever, and saying we don't want this, we don't want our society changing because it's evolving and we don't like it. I think we need to look beyond our borders and see what's happening in the rest of the world, and recognize that first of all, we have a very unique country, and that really we can change how things go in this country, how we move forward. We have the power to do that, but I think it requires a little bit more of us. It requires us making the effort to say, I'm going to stop looking at this person through the prism of a stereotype, and I'm going to meet him as a Guyanese, and talk to him or her as a Guyanese. And I think that's the first step. Sorry, I'm jumping ahead to solutions.
It's
But
it's
no, but
good.
yeah, but it's just that I actually have a bit more aggressive view on them, in the sense that
Okay.
I think we spent a great deal of time looking at and sort of creating this mythos with regard to our mineral and material wealth and stuff like that. This was concept of El Dorado, and expressed in material terms, when I think our greatest wealth is in fact our diversity. It's a diversity that's sort of presaged what is happening globally now. It has been pushed by migration, by technology, etc. And it's resulting primarily in conflict. We've had conflicts, but we have existed, I think, for a very long time in a microcosm of what the world is currently being shaped out to be. In the sense that we have had fairly equitably distributed ethnic and racial, religious diversity that have coexisted in one place for a fairly long time. Now, what we need to do is find ways for greater cohesion. And I don't think we're that far off. I think it is that we aggressively push back on the exacerbations caused by political divisions. We're far closer to the solution, and when we get that solution, I think what we need to do is to start marketing it globally, because that sort of paradigm for coexisting is what's currently needed, which is going to have increasing currency over the next 100 years. We have lessons. I mean, I saw this movie Black Panther, and the whole thing is about the vibranium as a resource and stuff like that, the technology. We have here sort of a metaphor. It's a metaphor for us in the sense that remember at the end of the movie they were asking, and if you haven't seen it yet, it's your fault.
Spoiler.
Yeah. But at the end of the movie, post-credit scene, Charlotte, the principal, kind of comes and says, We now intend to share what we have with the rest of the world, and the people, somebody stops and say, what can a small nation really give to us? We can give that sort of, it's essentially a technology of being able to coexist in the same place. But as in Wakanda and in movie, we have to get our internal strife, set certain core principles and where we are culturally, where we are socially, how it is that we look at issues of governance, equitable distribution of resources, etc. And then say, we tell the rest of the world, we are now struggling right now with people who live that are supposedly drastically different from each other, trying to coexist in the same place. You know, we did it 100 years ago. We had some issues, but we got ourselves together now, and this is how we do it.
Okay.
I think, understanding each other is very important. I like to draw from experience, my personal experience and with my child as well. She was she was known as the indigenous person in the school that she went to. So for anything Amerindian, they would call on Soraya, and they would call on her mom. They would call on us, anything. So they recognized that, and I appreciated that. That, at least there was an extension of goodwill to learn something about you, to learn something about your culture, as much as it's it's not well known, and learn it differently as well, because of my experience and my background, I have more than just the ordinary TBC skirt
Yeah.
and TBC Brazil experience, right? I have more than that to share with the regular Guyanese. And I'm also happy to say that I think we can focus a lot on the youths.
Yeah.
We can focus a lot on the youths, because from that same scenario, her friends were Chinese, I call a bit of that now, Black, Indian, and all the mixtures. And I'm auntie to all of them, which makes me very happy as well, right? Because I'm not seen as the Amerindian person anymore, I'm just seen as the mother, right? And somebody who they can come to and feel comfortable in being in the same environment that I was, and also to learn from my experience and from my daughter's experience as well. So I think we have to take the good from the elders, and the not so good, we have to see how we can put that aside and work on our youths and see how we can use them as the ones to bring things together. I think that's one of the way we can go. But aside from that, a lot of education and a lot of awareness as to the whole mix and composition of who we are as Guyanese, and appreciate everyone for who we are.
I just want to add another dimension here that I think is important. I don't think the composition of this panel, because I knew you were looking for people. I don't think the composition of this panel is incidental. I recognize my anomalous status here. I honestly think that as history is evolving, I think women have much more to offer in terms of solutions out of this morass than men do. I think this panel here is the sort of there needs to be inclusion of Nadia. So, but I think this sort of composition, I think it's the sort of primary paradigm that we need to find a way out of where we are now. I think women, on a cognitive basis, much more efficient than men, and this is something that is been studied scientifically in terms of empathy and reaching out and erasing this concept of otherness. Again, scientifically based, women are far more prone to that. And the issue of the sort of what this world needs is sort of a sort of a maternal approach to governance, as opposed to this aggressive adversarial path we've gone on throughout the entire history. But of course, we have a lot to change in terms of where we are in terms of patriarchy in the society, etc. But this is a start, clearly.
I think we should be talking too about social media. I think social media has become a place, a space where, which is good, but also has tremendous power in shaping, how we think and feel about each other. And I think it's sometimes I feel like it's working against us. And I think the reason for that is very often you see issues exacerbated along racial lines. So something happens and one group of people will be screaming one thing on social media, another group will be screaming. So you sort of see this, and then it's all coming at you, all this information, and people are sharing selectively what they want to share and so on, to shape opinion, to shape each other's opinions and so on. And it does have an impact. It does, it stays with you. And it concerns me that sometimes there isn't sufficient scrutiny of what we're saying on social media, and it's because I think there is no personal responsibility sometimes for what you put out there. You can just rant and say something and then leave it there, and then others will talk and you'll have conversations, but no one will necessarily call you out. If it you'll find you'll attract the people more often than not who agree with you. Occasionally you get the few you'll have an argument with and so on. Ruel knows this well because he's very strong on social media and has used it to shape opinion many times, but we won't get into that in this show. But I think that there is a danger of using it irresponsibly, and of course you can't tell people how they must use it, but I think it was really saddened me when I see us destroying each other on social media and not trying to reach out and to understand where we're coming from, because at the end of the day we're all humans, we're all dealing with insecurities and fears and uncertainties, and we're all fearful of the future. We're fearful of what's happening in Guyana. We don't know what to expect with oil wealth. We don't know what to expect in 2020. I think all of those uncertainties tend to be blown up on social media, and we end up attacking each other. And I worry that because young people are using social media so much more than us, I think I believe Facebook is for older people and Instagram and so on is for the younger people. Isn't that correct? I don't know.
I'm
what I hear.
I'm old at heart.
So it's the conversations that I read sometimes that leave me feeling despondent. I don't know if there is a way of changing opinion on social media. I don't know if it's, sometimes I try and then I think, is it worth the effort? Because we feel like you're fighting against the tide, and very often we want people to agree with our position. We don't like people to counter that. There's another element of it which I found also disturbing. I don't know if Ruel has come across this or Jean, but there are a great many people in the diaspora who, and I'm not saying it's everyone, but there are a lot of people who left Guyana hurt during different periods in our history, and they left and they went away and they created new lives and so on, and they had experiences of living in here under different political rule and so on, administration. So they come back to social, they've now been given access, and they come to social media with all this anger and frustration and all the things that they carried with them about Guyana. And I often think that they don't really know who we are anymore. They still have that image of us as we were then, and it's a static image, and they've held on to that. And very often I find they're the most vocal and virulent ones on social media. That is a concern to me, because I think I see very often there's a very strong correlation between the rage and race. It's very fully expressed on Facebook, because again there's no responsibility for statements that you make.
One of the key things that I like to ask in conversations on race, and Miss LaRose articulated some of the issues faced by indigenous Guyanese, but I also want to hear from you, Nadia, and from you, Ruel, some of the issues faced by individual ethnic groups. So, for example, Indo-Guyanese and Afro-Guyanese, because I think that just as Ms. LaRose articulated some of these issues, part of understanding how to deal with the situation is understanding exactly what is the problem.
If I may, a couple of things, and I think when I say this, I recognize that my personal experience is arguably anomalous, certainly to the experience of a lot of people. I am from what I would consider sort of a mixed race family. My heritage has been Portuguese, indigenous, Indian, and Afro-Guyanese. Physically, I guess the randomness, the laterally is how I look at it. I'm very proud of how I look. I'm going from that family, structured family life. I went to President's College, which sort of forced microcosm of diversity. We had to live with people of different ethnicities, etc. So you, in that, was socialized at President's College. To sort of, there was great deal of equity because wherever circumstance you came from, whether it's economic or thing, you had to eat the same bread. Every force went in there, everybody had to have their own bat of shoes. There was no diversity in terms of the uniform you wore and stuff like that. And that's sort of imprinted way. I certainly believe that I have faced racial or racist sentiment, but I suspect that because I wasn't sensitive to it, I wasn't tuned to look out for it. I mean, I've had issues with that. Remember one time I was with my ex-wife, a young family, and we called up looking for an apartment to rent. And it was okay when we turned up. One looked at us and suddenly the apartment was rent for rent half hour before was taken. So small things like that. I mean, but I also understand, and I've gotten first-hand experience of people, and this is where I think I can speak fairly well from all races, people from different races who have come to me and said, this has been my particular experience. This sort of has been either visceral or it's been casual racism. People overtly calling people racist names, people treating people, denying people access to services because of their race. So that particular, this is because I've focused on working in culture, and so I sort of served as a lodestone for that sort of narrative. And I could see, even as there's racial prejudice that exists on a personal level, and then there's what we call structural institutionalized racism. The first, you have to speak. There's always a work in progress to sort of mitigate and educate people. The other, that is what becomes particularly dangerous. I've seen it. I mean, it's been my experience. I've seen it operate at a severe level, particularly on the previous political administration. To the point, Jean and I served on the board of the State Paper Original Chronicle, to the point where there were like racist editorials, and that was a very overt expression of racist thing. And certainly, when there was a change of political administration in 2015, there was a sentiment, and I'm pretty sure it still exists, that there should be a reversal of that. Not the erosion of it from state structures, but it should be that the state structure should now serve um, well, frankly, Afro-Guyanese now. And these are the things that we need to guard against. We need to establish that there has to be equitable philosophy equity, sorry, when it comes to the structures that are supposed to benefit us as citizens. And citizens have a critical role to play in ensuring that those structures operate like that. But that has been how I've engaged in them. I can't give you a personal story. And I suspect it's largely because, one, I haven't been dependent on structures. I haven't made myself dependent on structures to be able to face that sort of structural racism. And personally, I think I'm a spoken person, I'm a loud mouth. So I think the chances of somebody coming to me with it are very low, as opposed to other people who don't have that sort of outspoken nature.
Okay, thank you, Ruel.
I'm a bit of an anomaly, so I'm not sure that I could speak for particulars. But I will say this before I say anything personal about myself. I think we're all capable of being racist. I think we all harbor our own personal feelings about and grudges about other people, and I think sometimes we need to be honest about that and admit that to ourselves, and then try to change that behavior if possible, or disabuse ourselves of whatever it is we're thinking. My family is, like Rose, I can't speak for any one race, but we came from Linden, Wisma, and settled in, well, Agricola. And so my experience has always been of living in a mixed space. But also that my family I grew up knowing about Hinduism and Christianity and Islam, because there were all these different people in my family. So I left Guyana at a very young age and went to live in the UK. Now, I think that for me was an eye-opener in terms of just seeing myself as an outsider. I never felt that way in Guyana, although, there were times when you were called names or whatever in school and things like that. And I don't know if you remember, back in the old days, you'd have those songs like all of that, and so you'd have those things that were upsetting at the time, but you really didn't take them on because you're children. I went to live in the UK, and I remember going to school for the first time, primary school, and bless her soul, my grandmother bought me a pair of boots that looked like cowboy boots, and I went to school, and I was strange because I had what sounded like a West Indian accent, but I looked the way I look, and my school was largely Caucasian and Afro, a few Afros, and Indus who were Pakistani and Bengali and so on. So I was very odd because I didn't look like the Jamaicans who were there, but I sounded a little bit like them. And so I remember being in the playground and being surrounded by all these children asking me because I said I came from Guyana and it's in South America, and they were asking me if I was an American Indian and did we ride on horses, and so it was a very strange experience, very confusing because I was very different from what was there. And interestingly enough, although you may think that, okay, you go somewhere strange, you might connect with the people who look more like you. Culturally, I connected with the Jamaican students. And so my experience was that although I had a few Pakistani friends or Bengali friends and so on, I largely gravitated to West Indians, so that, because culturally we were similar. And I think that kind of education makes you realize that really we belong to each other, we're not that different. And wherever we go in this world, and wherever we see each other, wherever we find each other, we will connect. And that has always given me hope, that connection, that we'll always find common ground, no matter what, our issues are locally and so on. And you see that when you live overseas, you see that need to belong, that sense of finding home. And you don't realize how important that is until you connect with people who are like you, culturally or otherwise. So I have never boxed myself in to a particular race. I try not to. I have always just regarded myself as a Guyanese. So I'm not sure that I can answer your question.
That's okay. Okay, so in the last few minutes of the show, what I want to ask you is, and this is probably the major question, my friend would call it the dun-dunno. How do we translate these thoughts and feelings into policy? What would that look like? Because in order to have things change in Guyana for the better, this is what we need. So how do we do that?
I think if you ask me, I would start with constitutional reform. I think we must have systems where people must feel that they are being treated fairly, equitably. Everything is based on meritocracy rather than nepotism and all the other things that we know take place in small societies where people are connected familiarly and otherwise. I think that if you have trust in the system, you are less likely to be looking at each other suspiciously, saying, you got the job because you're a particular race or because it's your cousin or uncle or whatever. I think if our systems, if our institutions are strong enough to withstand changes in government, changes in administration, so that you don't change the core of the institution, that it remains solid, and people can have faith in the system, then you will engender a sort of belief that things are okay, But whenever government changes, and a lot of what happens, a lot of our fears are driven by what happens in government. And so every time government changes and people lose jobs and then other people get jobs and, there's this whole shift, you become fearful again. People feel vulnerable. We talk about, very often we contextualize the hinterland and indigenous people only in the context of who are they going to vote for, who's going to give them things to make them vote for them, and so there's that suspicion, if you give them an outdoor moto or whatever, all these sorts of statements are made, then they'll vote for you, and those suspicions. And I think if we could trust the system, we would be able to live. I think we could live with each other. I'm not sure that that's the only solution, but certainly the way I look at it.
My advocacy life has been basically what you just said. Pushing for legislative and policy reform, but implementation is very important as well, because you can have stuff on paper, and that's where trusting the system and making the system work comes into play. Right? There's so many things that can happen once the right policy in place, once the right legislation is in place there. And like I said, that has been my life in terms of, again, for the indigenous people, how do we make those systems work for us? The political situation, yes, as Nadia pointed out, that is exactly what happens for the indigenous communities at elections time. Promises, outward engines, tractors, splitting families apart, encouraging each other to badmouth each other, when all of us are suffering, all of us have the same problems. And if we are to come together and try to work on a common solution, then we go forward, rather than allowing somebody to pull us apart. And therefore we gotta really work on strengthening the system, and unfortunately being able to trust it and being able to depend on it as well. And I say unfortunately because of current moves that I see in terms of being able to freely move, being able to freely speak, freedom of speech. Of course, there's with these rights there are responsibilities as well, but we have to maintain all of those.
I think we've got to, sorry, go ahead. I just think we need to do a great deal more self-analysis of our own fears, but also how we treat others. You know, we, as I said earlier, we're capable of racism, we're capable of xenophobia, and we've seen that play out when you've had, you know, people come here seeking refuge from other countries, neighboring countries, and so on. The things that are said on social media and the press and so on, how we treat them. They come to our country looking for a safe place, as we have done in the past, and we're not kind to them, you know. And I think that's unfortunate, because Guyanese have benefited from the kindness of others. And I think if we started to look at ourselves critically and ask ourselves, you know, how would we have lived had we not, you know, traveled and gone to other places and benefited from kindness? But also, how do we treat each other, you know? And I think that that kind of introspection is what we need, but also a robust education system that teaches us about not just, we don't want to know about just what the colonizers did. Let's talk about contemporary issues. What about all the things that happened around the time Walter Rodney was alive, and what he was doing, what his ideas were? Because, you know, I think all of that is missing from our education, and we just have this narrative, this ongoing narrative that's fed to our children, you know, and we've missed out on big chunks of our history that really could change how we look at each other.
Well, just briefly, I guess I have the dubious benefit of working in policy, and there is current, certainly the work of Department of Social Cohesion, and with the work I personally do with culture and cultural policy. It's a step in the direction, but there are significant gaps. We don't have an actual grounding or fundamental understanding of where we've come from. Absent, I've seen from current policy initiatives, are the fundamental understanding of who we are as former plantation societies and what it means. There's this lady who wrote this brilliant book, Stains of the Name War in My Veins, Black Williams, 1991. Leo Desprez wrote a book on culture and politics in 1965. That sort of historical material has not made it into a policy. So currently, even as we look at the issues of social inclusion, which is what Jane is speaking about, and macro levels constitutional reform that Nadia speaks to, we have to also have a very complex and overarching policy agenda, when it comes to citizenship as a whole. And to me, that is how we're going to. This is a very short show.
Yes.
Expand on that. But that's how we're going to be able to tackle it and make a difference.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. That hour just went by so quickly.
Yeah.
So, Ruel, Nadia, Jean, thank you so much.
I wanted to
for being on
ask him,
African Drums.
where's the cultural policy, sir?
We'll ask him that on Facebook. We are literally out of time. Viewers, thank you for staying with me. This has been African Drums, the television organ of the Coffee 250 Committee, an organization dedicated to the empowerment of the African Guyanese community through education and the encouragement of self-activity. Please like our Facebook page, it's Coffee 250. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, also Coffee 250, for videos of the show. Check out our website, www.coffee250.com, and please join us next week. I'm Elsie Harry, and please stay tuned for African History Corner. Thank you.
Remember the golden age of the Moors. Recall in 711, the Moors crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and entered the Iberian Peninsula, which they colonized and called it Al-Andalus, as shown on your screen. While there, they literally brought civilization to the peninsula: agriculture, medicine, astronomy, navigation, sciences and arts, and built cities, libraries, public baths, residences, civil infrastructure unknown at that time in the rest of Europe. The Iberian Peninsula was the showpiece of the West. More importantly, they brought education and literacy to the Iberian Peninsula and made it publicly available at a time when the kings of Europe could not read. Toledo became a city of translators who translated the Moorish texts into European languages and distributed the text throughout Europe. And this is how Europe got access to the written word. This is how Oxford and Cambridge and other universities got their first textbooks, from the Moors. And this is what jump-started the birth of Europe. Well, what happened after 1492, when the golden age of the Moors ended? Hi, I'm Norman McQueen, and this is Paragraphs of the African History Book. Well, something quite amazing happened. Recall the prime beneficiaries of the Moors were Spain and Portugal of the Iberian Peninsula. In 1494, just 2 years after the golden age of the Moors ended, these two nations declared themselves the world's superpowers, and Pope Alexander VI issued a decree that divided the world in two, at what is called the Treaty of Tordesillas between Portugal and Spain. The arrow points to the location of the dividing line. This basically gave all the non-Christian lands and resources undiscovered by these two nations in east of the dividing line to Portugal and west of the dividing line to Spain. This dividing line was officially recognized in 1506. The problem is these lands had been developed by others and were fully occupied for thousands of years. There were millions of Africans and Amerindians. Amerindians are African Mongol mixtures in North America with their own names and culture. There were millions of people in Central America with their own civilizations that existed for thousands of years. Right? Likewise, there were millions of West Africans and Amerindians in South America. The Amazon basin was not a pristine jungle inhabited by hunters and gatherers in small mobile groups foraging for an existence. There were walled cities with populations in the thousands, enjoying a lifestyle similar to the Moors on the east shores of the Ethiopic Ocean, also known as the Atlantic Ocean. Nevertheless, the Spanish sailed west and forcibly occupied lands in the name of king and Christianity. The Portuguese sailed east and did the same thing. Note, the local populations that existed did not vanish without a trace, as Eurocentric scholars like to report. Current scholars of their own history now understand that these folks were killed by the invading Spanish and Portuguese with the blessings of Christianity. Justification? They are children of Ham, or not fully human. Note also that the Gutenberg Bible was printed in 1454, and the Quran was approved at a meeting of Arab nations in Egypt in just 1919. So the local folks that greeted the Spanish and Portuguese had no knowledge of Christianity and were practicing a form of traditional Mohammedanism, or had their own religious and spiritual practices. The goal of the papal decree, however, was to Christianize everyone. Folks, the myths and allegories written in books and told to the world as religion and history are truly incredible. But as Queen Mother Moore says, we must correct history that at present denies our humanity and self-respect. We must. It is in no one's self-interest to tell us our historical facts. We must recognize this. And since in this age of information, ignorance is a choice. That's correct. Ignorance is a choice. Your choice. Choose wisely, not only for yourself, but for your children and grandchildren. Build solidly and expand your knowledge with facts, not myths and allegories. Strive to know your story and know yourself. Until next time, I'm Norman McQueen.